Alright, for those of you that noticed the delay in me getting this last set of notes up for the year, this is the video that held the system up. Not really sure why, it just did. Probably the communists running the internet didn't want to be embarrassed at the fact that they lost the Cold War. Or did they? I don't know. Read the news. Let's find out. We're just going to talk about the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. So let's see exactly how it is. We won and they lost. We're going to start by talking about Ronald Reagan. If you've already watched the Reagan lecture, we kind of mentioned a little bit of this, but we didn't go into great detail about it. Reagan increased defense spending, and I talked about that in the Reagan lecture. One of the things that he did in increasing defense spending was they actually updated a lot of the stuff in the military. So that they updated a lot of World War II era stuff. For instance, the USS Missouri, which is a battleship where the Japanese surrendered, it had been decommissioned, meaning it had been sent to port and was just sitting there. It was recommissioned, and it had modern equipment installed on it. And it would be used later on in the Persian Gulf War in the early 1990s with some of this brand new equipment that had been put on it. So they updated and refurbished a lot of stuff that went all the way even back to World War II. The funding of the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars program, that was a huge increase in spending. They also started recruiting more people in the military. The reason that Reagan gave for doing this was because of the Cold War, where he wanted to force the Soviet Union to keep up. He wanted to force an arms race with the Soviet Union. And on the one hand, that sounds crazy. But his reasoning was that the Soviet economy could not keep up. And that if we were able to increase our defense spending by, I want to say it's only like 5%, in order to keep up, the Soviet Union would have to increase their defense spending by something like 20 or 25%. And so this huge jump for them that they would not be able to maintain. And so that was his goal through increased defense spending. The invasion of Grenada, that was an attempt to remove a communist government. We did. Funding of anti-communist activities around the world. Okay, the Contras in Nicaragua. Okay, that was illegal. But there were other activities around the world where he was able to send money and send aid and send help and provide for anti-communist activities to force the Soviet Union then into a position where they had to spend money to counter us or allow their allies and friends and whoever to potentially fall. So that's what's going on from the United States side of it. Now, in the Soviet Union, there's other changes going on. And some people argue that what happened in the Soviet Union is much more responsible for the end of the Cold War than anything the United States did. In the Soviet Union, in 1985, this guy, Mikhail Gorbachev, became the Secretary General. So he became the leader of the Soviet Union. And if you see the birthmark on his forehead, that's one way you can always identify him. If you get a political cartoon or something, look for the spot on the forehead. Political cartoonists, they turned that into whatever it was they wanted to turn it into. But that was one way you always knew exactly who it was they were talking about. And so he became Secretary General, leader of the Soviet Union in 1985. And he was young. He was in his 40s. Okay? Up until this point, it has been very old guys running the Soviet Union. Before Gorbachev, the guy that he came after, if I remember correctly, he was like 89 years old, and he lasted about 6 months. The guy before him was 90 years old, and he didn't last that long either. But because they were trying to get people that had been there from the beginning. Well, Gorbachev is the young blood, and he kind of looked around at the Soviet Union and realized they couldn't keep up, that there were problems. And so he started actually trying to reform things in the Soviet Union. One of the big reforms that he introduced was something called Glasnost. Glasnost was freedom of the press and freedom of speech. Okay? Glasnost translates as openness. So it was allowing the people and the press more freedom to criticize the communist government, something that really hadn't been done. There were a little bit of freedoms, but not a whole lot. You could question government activities. Now, another big reform was something called perestroika. Perestroika was economic restructuring, changing the economy of the Soviet Union from a purely communist system and allowing very, very, very limited private business. Like I said, very limited. Maximum of 10 employees. But the economy of the Soviet Union was not doing well at all. Studies suggested that the black market, the illegal market in the Soviet Union, was actually greater than the legal market in the Soviet Union. In other words, more money was being changed hands illegally than it was legally. That is not good for your economy. In addition, Gorbachev would pull Soviet troops out of Afghanistan in the late 80s. If you remember from the Carter notes, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. That had kind of become their version of Vietnam. And so he pulled Soviet troops out after they could not defeat Afghanistan. He also began to cut military and economic aid to the communist countries in Eastern Europe. He knows his economy is not working very well. He knows he's got to save money. And so he starts looking at those communist governments in Eastern Europe and saying, look, you're going to have to start shouldering more of your own economic burden. Your budget is going to have to be paid for by you. We can't do it anymore. And so those changes set the stage for meetings between Gorbachev and Reagan, and later between Gorbachev and President George H.W. Bush, to start trying to relax tensions between the two countries. Gorbachev and Reagan will meet several times. That will lead to disarmament talks between the two countries. Gorbachev is going to come to the United States to visit. Reagan is going to go to the Soviet Union to visit. And so leaders of both countries started building a personal relationship that was helping to mend then this political relationship between the two countries. In June of 1987, one of the more iconic speeches of the Cold War happens when President Reagan visited West Berlin. And in front of this place called the Brandenburg Gate, the separation between East and West, Reagan gives this speech. And in the speech, he says, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. The Berlin Wall was not erected by the democracies. The Berlin Wall was erected by communists to keep communists inside, to keep people who wanted freedom from escaping. And this is toward the end of Reagan's term. He doesn't have necessarily a whole lot of political pull, but that's a big deal. That statement is a big deal. That the onus is kind of on the Soviet Union to do what it can to end the Cold War. President George H.W. Bush, he would continue meeting with Gorbachev, and he would continue those summits. There's another treaty that came out of it called the START Treaty, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty that came out. Then, in 1989, communism in Europe starts to fall. As the people of Eastern Europe started to reject communism country by country, and it started as a trickle, it started with changes in policies. The nation of Hungary demilitarized its border with Austria and started to allow people to move freely across the border from communist Hungary into the Western aligned Austria. In June of 1989, the country of Poland had truly free elections for the first time since the end of World War II. And this man, Lech Walesa, who was the leader of what started out as a union, Solidarity, and evolved into a political party, he was ultimately elected president of Poland. Okay? This union, because all workers work for the government, the union had been fighting against the government and what they perceived as unfair treatment of the workers. Well, then they got into politics. Well, all political parties besides the Communist Party are illegal in communist systems. Poland legalized the Solidarity Party, and in the first truly free election, they won, and the communist government gave over control of the government to the new party. In November of 1989, East Germans in Berlin who were protesting continued communist government and restrictions on what they saw as their rightful freedoms, they forced the free opening of checkpoints between East and West Berlin. You could go between East and West Berlin, but it had to be for business, and you had to go through these checkpoints, and you had to make sure you were coming back. They forced the opening of these checkpoints, and when they did, it forced the East German government then to remove the Berlin Wall, and eventually led to the reunification of East and West Germany. In December of 1989, the entire government in Czechoslovakia resigned. They were all communists, and they all resigned and called for free elections the following year, which would be won by opposition parties. So, communism all over Europe, all over Eastern Europe started to fall, and it fell in Bulgaria, and it fell other places, and most of the time it was very peaceful. Now, not always. There were a couple of instances where the fall of communism did not go as smoothly. The first one was the country of Romania. The dictator was a guy named Nicolae Ceausescu, and he would be executed. This is him and his wife being executed. Now, they were bad people. Don't feel bad for them. But they were arrested, and the execution squad was picked out before the judges, I think. So it was a completely fair trial. And so they were executed. He was the only leader of a communist country in Europe to be executed for crimes, of course. The other place that the collapse of communism did not work out real well was in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia had been created at the end of World War I. One of the biggest problems with Yugoslavia is that they just kind of crammed every ethnic group they could think of in that region into this one country. Yugoslavia means land of Slavs. They didn't care who you were. They just threw you in the country. And the communist dictatorship had really been what was holding that country together. And so when the government fell, Yugoslavia just broke apart into a number of different countries, all essentially governed by different ethnic groups. And in one country, the country of Bosnia and Herzegovina, between 1992 and 1995, there was this horrible civil war that existed between ethnic groups, and there were three main ethnic groups in there. Of course, the Bosnians are the ones that should be there, but there were also Serbians that lived there. There were Croatians who lived there, and you really did have neighbor turning against neighbor in many different cases. The Serbs were supported by Serbia. The Croatians were supported by the country of Croatia also. But the Serbs, with the backing of Serbia, began doing something called ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing is the 1990s version of genocide. Ethnic cleansing just sounds a lot better. But they would round up people who were not of their ethnic group, lock them into concentration camps, and still today, 2020, they are looking for mass graves from the war crimes that were committed during the Civil War. Now, in 1991, in August, there was a coup against Gorbachev in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was facing continued economic hardships. You have the tide of the Cold War turning against them, as Eastern Europe is rejecting communism. In the summer of 1991, there were three republics of the Soviet Union, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and they announced their intentions to break away and become independent, and Gorbachev was going to let them do that. But before that could happen, there was a coup. There was an attempt by other leaders within the Soviet Union to remove Gorbachev and take power. And for a time they did, and their plan, their stated goal, was to undo his reforms and to strengthen the Soviet communist policies. And the problem with giving people freedom is people like it. And you can't take it back. And so when they announced what they were going to do, the people of the Soviet Union turned against the coup. All around in all the major cities in the Soviet Union, there were demonstrations against them. In Moscow, the Russian president Boris Yeltsin, who is this guy right here. Now, he's a member of the Communist Party, but he led the protests against the coup in Moscow. And this is a photograph, actually, of him and his supporters standing on top of a tank. Behind them, the white building, that is the government building in Moscow, that the coup leaders were held up in, and they had called in the military to protect them from the demonstrators. And eventually, the military turned against the leaders. And so, at that moment, the coup was over. It fails within days. And here comes the end of the Cold War. The coup fails. Gorbachev comes back into power. But no one is listening to him anymore. We are now focused on Boris Yeltsin. We are focused on the leader of Ukraine. We are focused on the leaders of Belarus. We are focused on the leaders of the different republics that made up the Soviet Union. And in December of 1991, several of those leaders got together and they signed a document declaring that at the end of 1991, the Soviet Union would cease to exist and they would split up into their own separate countries. And that is how the Cold War ends. Not with a nuclear war, not with a violent confrontation, but with people signing a piece of paper saying, we don't want to live under this system anymore. Now, what's been the result of that? You see there in the green what the Soviet Union used to be. And these countries still face a lot of hardships. The ones that have kind of done better have been the Balkans. The Baltic states here, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They've done better. Belarus, still kind of ruled by a dictator. Ukraine, well, it's not this big anymore. This part belongs to Russia now. You don't hear just a whole lot about the rest of the countries. Okay? Mostly because they have issues with poverty. Some of them have issues with continued dictatorships. So it's been kind of a mixed bag. But either way, the Cold War was over, and we won, and that's it. The Soviet Union goes out with a whimper. Hope that provides you with some context. Sorry it wasn't more exciting.